Hello, YouTube aficionados. I am Sean Stoker, and this is Crazy Native Philosophy. This one is going to be a wild ride. Today's video is called My Mentor, Standing Strong Eagle Man. So to tell the story of my second greatest mentor, whose native name, or I'd like to say his real name, was Standing Strong Eagle Man. His American name is Robert Lujan. First, I need to give a little backstory before I talk about Robert. My primary mentor, Good Boy, or Rick Cliff, gave me teachings almost daily on traditional ways for years. Rick taught me about real Native history, culture, ceremonies, medicine men, indigenous healing, and non-physical aspects of life that some people call spiritual. On top of all that, I was personally going through an extremely turbulent time in my life, and Good Boy coached me and mentored me and counseled me and guided me through the absolute worst of it. I probably still wouldn't be above ground if it wasn't for him. At one point, I literally thought I was going insane, and I told Rick, he told me go crazy, and that it's natural and it's part of life. And he said, people go crazy every day. Why not you? So at that time, I didn't know what that meant. It was just relentless and unbearable and psychological pressure that I felt every single day. And Rick gave me all the tools, but ultimately it was my road to walk it. And if I chose to walk it. Now, to the leery Westerner with a stoic sense of rationality, what I'm about to say may seem a little odd. And perhaps this was all a random set of circumstances that happened to fall into place at exactly the right time. Or maybe it was something else, right? I once asked one of my very first mentors, Ron Anderson, about what philosophers call predetermination or fate versus self-determination or free will. I was helping Ron build his house, and I asked if everything really does happen for a reason. And we were in Ron's pickup truck, and Ron replied, there's this big oak tree in front of us, and he said, sometimes the leaf falls from the tree, and sometimes the leaf falls from the tree. Now, Ron and Wallace Black Elk possessed one gift above and beyond all the rest, and that was a world-class sense of humor. And as the saying goes, laughter is powerful medicine. And all medicine men or ceremony leaders seem to have a very good one. But Ron and Wallace often had me laughing months after they would say or do something. So when Ron said this, I laughed, right? But in that laughter, the lessons get branded home. And this is a very powerful indigenous teaching in and of itself. So I couldn't tell you if Rick Cliff introducing me to Robert Lujan was the leaf falling from the tree, or if it was the leaf falling from the tree. But it sure is an odd set of circumstances. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was just kind of over the tipping point of this relentless, unbearable psychological tug of war that was going on inside of me every day, all day long. But that downslope was definitely not a sharp drop, and that pressure took a very long time to ease up. So Good Boy had told me to go crazy, and I didn't understand that at all. And then he introduced me to a crazy ceremony leader that would become my new mentor. And it wouldn't be long after that Rick was going to be leaving Madison and moving to Haskell in Lawrence, Kansas. And Haskell is a Native American college, and Cliff was moving his wife and his two sons down there to be close to his daughter. So I don't know if Rick knew he was heading to Haskell when he transitioned me over to Robert or not. But it is funny that he was on his way out of my daily life and Robert was on his way in. And good boy helped me through the roughest patches, and standing strong Eagle Man showed me how to live with it. He also taught me a lot of the technical aspects of ceremonies that I was lacking. So one day, Rick Cliff called me up and said he was going to a sweat lodge at some guy's house. And he asked if I wanted to go with him. And I was like, of course, right? Any chance to hang out with Cliff, I learned traditional ways I was never going to pass up. And at that point, I'd never been in a NEPI with Rick, and I was eager to get his insights and teachings while going through it. So Cliff told me he was going to see some guy named Robert, right? So we get to Robert's place, and it didn't hit me until later, but Robert's place was a very typical, I would say, medicine man's house, right? At least like the ones that I've met in my life. From the street, it was, a very cozy, humble little house, nothing special at all. But it had a very warm, kind of cheery feel about it, and it was located just outside of Madison on the northeast side of town. There was a small embankment that the house sat on, and in back there was a swing set for the kids and a small metal shed and a sweat lodge. Robert would later add 4 wooden pallets that he kept stacked high with firewood. And little did I know that all these events would lead me to being Standing Strong Eagle Man's firekeeper and his #1 wood chopper. So Ron Anderson and Robert Lujan must have thought I was a serious slacker, because whenever my foot touched the soil of their property, those guys always put me to work. So for anyone driving by Robert's house, it was just a completely unassuming little house from outside appearances. So Cliff and I walked around behind Robert's house, and I saw the fire was blazing away in the fire pit, and the lodge sat back, kind of tucked away under some trees. And standing at the fire was a short, stocky character that Rick must have met before, because they started talking away like they'd known each other for a while. That guy's name was Russ, and Russ had this huge energy about him that was just boiling out of him, and it was like impossible to contain. To this day, my mind cannot picture him sitting quietly and patiently in some chair like at a doctor's office, or something like that. Like, he reminded me of the Tasmanian devil from the Bugs Bunny cartoons. So the more Russ talked, the more this guy seemed really wild. Beyond wild. His eyes had this craziness to them that just seemed to say, like, I chopped up 30 bodies in 6 states, and hey, I wonder if there's any Kool-Aid in the house. So they say the only thing a crazy man fears is someone crazier than himself. And I say that I'm crazy, but I always thought Russ had me beat by miles. I truly love that guy. He is my brother beyond this life and the next. Rick and Russ were in some big conversation as we stood by the fire pit, and I kind of drifted off from the conversation as I looked into the flames. And all of a sudden I hear Russ say, "Yeah, Robert's a Wendigo." And my mind snapped out of the fire, and I was like, what the hell did he just say? And blah, 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 blah. Wendigo. And I thought, holy crap, he just said it again. Blah, 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 Wendigo. And he said it there. He said it the 3rd time. I wasn't imagining it, right? Yep, there was no mistaking it. Russ had just said that Robert was a Wendigo 3 times. Now, what made this scary was he said it with this grin, like I duct tape cats to my body and wear them as clothes around the house. It was like nothing. And I was just stunned stupid. I couldn't believe he said this, right? So I looked over at Cliff, and he's standing there grinning too. And all of this was like completely normal. And I was starting to freak out a little bit inside. But outside, I was like steady as a rock, right? Outside, I was like this, but inside, I was starting to freak out. So from what I know, a Wendigo is a legend that comes from the Ojibwe people in northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, and throughout Canada. And I've heard a few different stories about Wendigos. Ojibways say that they're like Sasquatch or Bigfoot type people that are 12 to 18 feet tall, and they eat human flesh. So an Ojibwe teacher told me that Wendigos were almost human and were cannibals, and they possess superhuman strength, speed, and healing abilities. So the bottom line on all these stories I heard was Wendigos eat people. So while Russ and Rick are chatting away, my last remaining brain cells in there start having this tribal council meeting up there in my skull. And as I'm looking back in the flames, I'm thinking, so Robert's a Wendigo, huh? And then I'm starting to think, so does this crazy guy mean that Robert's a cannibal? Is that what he means? And then I look over at this Tasmanian devil character with this absolutely crazy look in his eye, and who's suddenly standing there calm as like a saint in church. And my brain is having no trouble thinking that Russ is a cannibal, right? And then I look over at Good Boy, and Cliff is just standing there looking like nothing out of the ordinary is going on. And then my brain starts freaking out, thinking and doubting him, right? I'm starting to think, well, I've never been in a sweat lodge with Cliff before. Maybe I really don't know him that well after all. Maybe he's a cannibal too, right? So it's at that exact moment when Robert comes walking around the corner of the house, and he's kind of acting all busy and stuff and doing things on the back porch, like he's moving the kids' bikes and picking up a gardening hose and licking flesh off a human skull, the usual. And Robert is totally acting like he's not paying attention to us, but you can tell he's totally paying attention to us. So he's over there kind of side-eyeing us, and I'm over here at the fire pit acting like I'm not paying attention to him either, but I'm totally side-eyeing him too, He's looking at me and I'm looking at him, and he's wondering if I taste good with barbecue sauce, and I'm looking at him like, how many bodies does he have stacked up in the basement? And so Standing Strong Eagle Man comes walking over, and then he shakes my hand, and we made introductions, and we joked a little bit and had a light conversation. And meanwhile, I was analyzing the crap out of this Robert guy, right? And trying to figure out what kind of man is this guy. And as I was studying his, the quality of his movement, his body language, his facial expressions, I analyzed how he interacted with the world around him, and I could see he was heavily studying me too, right? And then he strode away again and started to do more yard work. So I was standing by the fire, and I was trying to look totally chill, and outwardly I probably looked like I was shaking and chain smoking, and I was definitely wondering what the hell I got myself into. So I was about to go into Sweat Lodge with Robert, who barely talked since we got there, Russ, the Tasmanian devil with the energy like twice the size of his body, and then Rick Cliff, who was like as cool as an Assiniboine Fonzie, right? Grinning ear to ear. And I just had this picture of going in the lodge and the door going closed, being immersed in total blackness, and then like maybe a feasting song coming on, and two people would start chewing on me, So, but then it was time to go in. So it turned out to be a great inipi, and it was just the four of us. As Robert, Cliff, me, and Robert, Cliff, and myself were all combat veterans, and Russ was an Air Force brat. And we sat in the four directions, and when we crawled out, it felt like we'd known each other since the beginning of time. For months afterward, I kept asking everyone I knew if they knew anything about Wendigos, ceremony-wise, and no one knew nothing. A friend of mine who was a Canadian Cree had his mom come down to visit, and I even asked her, hoping she might know since she was from Canada. And that's where Robert's teachings all came from. And she had no idea either. So somehow I learned that a Wendigo from that tradition was the same thing as a Lakota Heyoka. And a Heyoka is often called a thunder dreamer or a sacred clown or a contrary person. So they're known for doing things backward or doing things in a crazy or a shocking way. And this was the kind of guy that Standing Strong Eagle Man was. He quite often did things, odd or funny things, and sometimes he did things that just straight up blew my mind. So right now, there's this new age spirituality movement going on, and there are a bunch of people who run around calling themselves Heyoka empaths. And I really don't understand what the heck they are doing, but it has no connection to Lakota Heyokas. The word Heyoka is a Lakota word. So I would venture to say that this has been culturally appropriated. Also, in Indian country, there seems to be a fad right now where everybody and their grandma is suddenly a Heyoka. The stories I hear are just straight up asinine, right? People are engaging in obnoxious or rude or just plain stupid behavior and then drop the excuse that they are a Heyoka, and that somehow excuses their behavior. Like when an idiot announces to a bar full of people that he's a Heyoka, and then he slams a beer and tells everyone that he's praying, right? People like this are not real Heyokas. Robert never put on a show for anybody. Whenever he did something funny, like spontaneously burst out into a little jig or something like that, it was to lighten the mood, right? Or whenever he would do something like unbelievable, he would always follow that up with just the exact right thing to say that would blow your mind. So far open like nothing else would. It was kind of like taking a bazooka to a mosquito. So there was always a paradigm shifting education behind why he did things the way he either did it for like fun and it's just his personality, or he did it to educate you in a huge, shocking way. So, he was odd and quirky and did these funny little things because that's how his brain worked, So like, for example, for a sweat lodge, some ceremony leaders use the grandfathers or the stones that go inside the sweat lodge. They just use them once, or other ceremony leaders will use them many times. So Robert reused his, and he had quite a little pile there on the side of his inipi, and I can close my eyes and I can picture a Standing Strong Eagle Man going through and sorting the stones this one day. And he'd pick them up and just kind of chuck them over his shoulder, the ones he didn't like. And now many people would consider those grandfathers sacred, and because they're used in the sweat lodge. But my memory of Robert on that particular day, with him standing there with his back kind of to me and picking up those grandfathers, looking at them for like 5 seconds, and then the ones he likes, he sets back down. The ones he doesn't like, he chucks over like as an old banana peel. Some real rigid traditionalist with a giant stick up their ass would probably freak out if they saw that. And I know people who would totally freak out. To me, that was Robert totally being Robert, He didn't do that for show or to blow my mind with some heavy insight. It was just how his Wendigo brain worked. And Robert wasn't trying to be a Wendigo or be a Heyoka. He didn't put on a show or seek approval. He was just that way, and that is how his brain worked. So I'll talk more about Heyokas in a future video, but that is a critical point, right? many people only know tradition, Thunder Dreamers have the insight to know what is important and what is not. Now, the first group of people that I started going to sweat lodges with were very by the book about everything. So, like, for example, like we were putting up a lodge once and somebody was flipping out because, every hole that the posts for the sweat lodge, poles would go in weren't exactly 6 inches deep or 8 inches deep or whatever. And, it's like natives, would measure stuff way back in the day. And, or it doesn't take into account different types of ground or any of that. So, Standing Strong Eagle Man would have given a couple of those guys heart attacks. The way he did stuff, like they were so uptight about everything. I think that's the best way to start out learning, but yeah, Robert blew the doors off of a lot of stuff. So after that first inipi at Robert's house, I had maybe a semester where he and Rick mentored me together, and I think that summer too, like I said. And then Rick moved to Kansas for his family, and he's still at Haskell now. So I became Robert's firekeeper for the next 7 years, which means I helped him run his sweat lodges and other ceremonies, both at the lodge behind his house and at the inipi we ran for the inmates at the Sand Ridge Correctional Facility in Mauston, Wisconsin. So I apprenticed under him the whole time, and good boy really taught me an incredible amount about traditional wisdom and knowledge and philosophy, and mentored me through a phase of my life that I literally thought I was going crazy. Robert taught me more about how to live with that craziness and what was important and what was not. And both men had a very clever wisdom about them. So before Rick moved to Haskell, they both sat me down and they told me that they both saw me one day pouring water, which meant running a sweat lodge. And since Robert went to the ancestors, I never have done that, but I will be doing that soon. I was such a messed up, hopeless kid. I often have a hard time believing that both men mentored me in my life. And would say that about me, Yeah. During those 7 years, Standing Strong Eagle Man, Russ, and this other guy named Tom were always at Robert's lodges. And the four of us were like the Four Musketeers. There were some natives in Indian country that only allow other natives into their ceremonies. And I've heard some places, you need to flash a tribal ID to come in. But I'll talk about those in future videos also. And I understand why people do this, right? And I don't fault them for that at all. But every one of my teachers was extremely open to anyone being at their ceremonies. Robert once told me that native medicine isn't just for native people. And he said, what happens if you see a little kid fall off their bike and get hurt? He said, are you not going to go over there and help that little kid, just because they're not native? He said, no, you go over there and help them, right? So I think about that lesson all the time, right? So the inipi at Robert's house with Robert and Russ and Tom and me couldn't have been as good as it was without all four of them. Russ knew and understood traditional native ways and ceremonies better than I'd say most natives I've ever known. And Tom had this super memory database of songs in his brain and could recall them all instantly. He definitely had a better voice than Robert, Russ, and I. So he was our primary singer from most things. One day at some native event or a powwow, I think it was, two native bulls confronted Tom and they're like, what tribe are you from? And And Tom, held his ground and said, "I'm from the Irish tribe." And both those guys busted up laughing, and he was accepted after that. So, they're great people. And during those 7 years with Robert, I was still struggling and with choosing my life path, and this was a source of intense psychological pressure, and I literally felt like every day, all day, I felt that pressure, and it made me feel like I was going crazy. And one day, Robert Lujan told me directly that I needed to put down the guns and the bombs and become a spiritual warrior. And I didn't know what he meant by that. And he further added, "You need to help bring people out of the darkness and into the light." And at the time, I thought this was kind of a new agey voodoo power crystal kind of thing to say. But now I understand, right? During that time in my life, giving up the guns and the bombs was the hardest thing for me to do. And it's still hard for me to do. It's all I've ever known in my adult life. It was my favorite game as a kid. And not to toot my own horn, but beep, beep, I was a pretty decent soldier, I guess. My life has been a constant cycle of warfare and then hanging out with medicine men to heal the wounds of warfare, and then going back and going back and going back. And giving that up felt like giving up me. Then I finally got a major injury, and the Army told me I was too old to play the Army game anymore. And then, like about 6 months ago, I learned that those two paths that Rick Cliff said that I had to choose between. I learned that there never was two paths. There was only one path all along, and I was always on it. And I will tell that story in another video coming up soon. So Robert White Wolf Lujan was born in 1952 in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He was a Vietnam combat veteran. He learned Ojibwe traditional ways to heal his own war wounds. And for a profession, he served as an AODA, or alcohol and drug abuse counselor, for both the Wisconsin Department of Justice and Department of Health Services. Standing Strong Eagle Man made the journey on January 14, 2005. I was in the Army for my third time when he passed, and a year later I ran into his wife in a parking lot of a Sears department store, and she told me that he had gone on. Robert stayed out of the mainstream of Indian country, and just Robert being Robert and creating community, and it left a big hole in his departure. I lost track of Russ and Tom, and I miss those guys with all my heart. So if you guys are seeing this, come find me, brothers. You are always in my prayers, and I miss you guys a ton. Aho, Matakiasi.